The morning rush at a downtown cafe had a rhythm to it, brutal, relentless, and completely unforgiving to anyone who dared slow down. She had learned that rhythm the hard way over 18 months of double shifts, aching feet, and tips that rarely added up to what she needed. But she showed up. Every single morning, she showed up. She was 24 and tired in the way that only comes from carrying too much for too long. Her uniform was pressed because she pressed it herself the night before, standing over a second-hand iron in a studio apartment where the radiator made sounds like something dying. She wore her hair pinned back tight, kept her chin up, and smiled at customers even when they looked through her like she was made of glass. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that starts ugly and gives no indication it intends to improve. The cafe was at full capacity by 9. Business people hunched over laptops, voices layered over the hiss of the espresso machine, someone's phone ringing too loud near the door. She moved through it all with practiced efficiency, balancing plates, reciting specials, refilling water glasses without being asked. She was good at her job. She took pride in that. He arrived at 9:20. She noticed him the way everyone noticed him, immediately and involuntarily. He walked through the door like a man who had never once in his life considered that space might not accommodate him. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of watch that cost more than her rent for the next 3 years. He was accompanied by two men who positioned themselves slightly behind and to either side of him, which she recognized, dimly, as the kind of arrangement that meant something she didn't fully understand yet. He was given the corner table without asking for it. The manager appeared from nowhere, smiling too widely, pulling the chair out himself. She watched for exactly 2 seconds before turning back to her section. It was the combination of things that happened at once. The customer at table 7 waving urgently, the new hire blocking the narrow aisle without realizing it, and her own foot catching the edge of the floor mat in a way it never had before, in 500 previous crossings of that same stretch of floor. She felt herself pitch forward, tried to correct, couldn't. The ceramic mug left her hand. Time did something strange. She watched the coffee arc through the air in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost designed, as if the morning had been building toward this single, terrible moment. It hit him across the chest and shoulder. White shirt, expensive, ruined. The sound she made wasn't a word. It was just breath, forced out of her body by horror. The cafe went quiet the way a room does when something shifts. Then one of the men beside him was on his feet, the larger one, jaw tight, eyes already deciding something on her behalf. He stepped toward her with the kind of controlled fury that understood its own authority completely. She stood there with the empty mug in her hand, the broken pieces of the moment scattered at her feet, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. The large man stopped 2 feet from her. That was the distance, 2 feet between her and whatever came next. A scene, a termination, humiliation broadcast to every person in the cafe who was now watching, with their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. She could feel their attention like heat. "Do you have any idea?" the man began. "Marcus." One word. Quiet. But carrying something that made the larger man stop as completely as if he'd walked into glass. The businessman hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved dramatically or stood up to assert himself. He had simply spoken the name, and it had been enough. She looked at him for the first time, really looked, not the peripheral glance she'd offered when she approached the table. The professional non-gaze that waitresses learn, because direct eye contact with certain tables reads as either flirtation or aggression. He was younger than she'd assumed, maybe mid-30s. Dark hair, slightly disheveled in a way that seemed accidental on a man who otherwise looked like nothing about him was accidental. His shirt was destroyed. The coffee had spread in an irregular bloom across his chest and left shoulder, already cooling against his skin, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the particular blankness of rich people who've decided not to lower themselves to a reaction. It was something attentive, assessing maybe, but not unkindly. "It's a shirt," he said. To her, not to the man called Marcus. To her specifically, which almost made it worse, because she hadn't expected to be addressed directly. She became aware that she was still holding the empty mug. She lowered it to her side. Her hand was trembling in a way she hoped wasn't visible from his distance, though she suspected it was. "I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. We'll cover the cleaning cost, obviously, and I can get you. You don't need to cover anything." He reached for a cloth napkin from the table, not grabbing, no urgency in it, and pressed it briefly against his shirt in a gesture that clearly understood the gesture was futile. "Is there somewhere I can go to change? My assistant has my bag in the car." That was it. That was the whole of it. No performance, no extracted apology, no requiring her to stand there longer than she already had while he decided what her humiliation was worth to him. She managed to direct him toward the back hallway, her voice steadier now, and he stood and followed her brief gesture with the same unhurried authority he'd applied to everything else. Marcus remained where he was, jaw still tight, watching her with an expression that made clear he had opinions he was merely postponing. The rest of the cafe began its slow return to noise. Cups lifted, conversations resumed. Her manager appeared at her elbow, and she braced herself for that particular conversation. But the manager was looking past her toward the hallway, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen on it before, something between calculation and a very private kind of alarm. "Do you know who that is?" he said. She had no answer for him. How would she? Men in custom shirts walked into the cafe occasionally. Businessmen killing time between appointments. Lawyers who preferred their espresso somewhere quieter than their offices. But they were background figures to her. They sat, they ordered, they left. She didn't catalog them. Her manager's face, however, was doing something she'd never witnessed in 3 years of working for him. The man who had once made her redo a drink order because the foam pattern was asymmetrical was now standing with his hands slightly open at his sides, as though he'd forgotten they were there. "His name is," her manager started and then stopped himself, dropping his voice so sharply she had to lean in. He said the name. It meant nothing to her. She searched her expression for recognition and found none, which seemed to alarm him more than her spilling the coffee had. "He owns this," her manager said, very quietly, very carefully, the way someone explains something to a person standing close to the edge of something high. She didn't understand immediately. "The cafe? The franchise?" He let the word land. "All 47 locations. The noise of the cafe continued around them. The hiss of the machine, someone laughing 2 tables over, the ordinary percussion of a morning that had somehow split into a before and after. She felt the information arrive somewhere in her chest rather than her head. 47 locations. The white shirt, the napkin she'd pressed against it with both hands shaking. The bodyguard's voice, "Do you have any idea?" And the hand that had risen, unhurried, to silence him. "He's never come in person," her manager said. "Not to any of them. Not once, as far as anyone knows." He was still watching the hallway. "We had an inspection last month. Regional manager flew in from Denver." He said this as though it were relevant, as though the Denver inspection were now, in retrospect, a dress rehearsal for something far larger. She stood very still. She tried to reconstruct the conversation she'd just had with the man. The way she'd told him the napkin wouldn't help. The way she'd directed him toward the back hallway with a gesture more suited to pointing out restrooms to strangers than addressing someone who, apparently, owned the building she was standing in. She had spoken to him like he was simply someone whose morning she had disrupted, because that was what she'd understood him to be. He hadn't corrected her. He'd been given every opening to correct her, and he hadn't taken a single one. Her manager turned to look at her then, fully, with an expression she recognized now for what it was. Not concern for her. Arithmetic. He was trying to calculate what her continued presence in the building meant for him, what the trajectory of this morning looked like from the outside, whether having a waitress who'd scalded the franchise owner still working her shift was a liability, or whether sending her home looked worse. "Stay visible," he said finally. "Attentive. If he comes back out and needs anything, you handle it personally. You understand?" She understood. She also understood that the instruction had nothing to do with her. She picked up her tray and went back to work. The cafe had found its rhythm again. Tables turned over, orders came in. The espresso machine hissed in its reliable pattern, and no one mentioned the incident anymore, at least not out loud. The glances had shifted from openly curious to something more careful, the kind of watching that pretended not to be watching at all. She felt every one of them. She moved through her section with the deliberate steadiness of someone who understood that the best thing she could do now was become unremarkable. Fill the water glasses before they were empty. Clear the plates before anyone had to ask. Smile at the right moments. Disappear into the background of someone else's morning. It was a skill she had developed long before this job, and she drew on it now without thinking. He had not come back out. The hallway door remained closed. Somewhere behind it, in whatever staff room or private space existed that she had never thought twice about before today, he was presumably handling whatever a man like that handled when his shirt had been made unwearable. She tried not to think about it. She mostly succeeded. What she could not entirely set aside was the memory of his voice. Not the words, the tone, the particular quality of patience in it when he'd spoken to the bodyguard. She'd processed conflict at this cafe before. Impatient regulars, entitled customers. One genuinely frightening scene with a man who'd disputed his check. She knew the difference between someone who was calm because they were indifferent and someone who was calm because they had decided to be. He had decided. She was refilling the sugar caddy at the counter station when the hallway door opened. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing because her manager was watching, and because she refused to be the kind of person who dropped everything the moment a powerful man reappeared in a room. When she did look up, he was already halfway across the floor, jacket back on, phone in hand, his bodyguard 2 steps behind him with the compressed energy of someone who had not yet resolved this morning to his own satisfaction. He paused near the counter, not at a table, not at the register, at the counter where she was standing. She met his eyes because looking away felt worse than whatever came next. "The coffee," he said, and her stomach dropped exactly once before he continued, "was better than I expected for a chain location." She blinked. It was such a specific, ordinary thing to say that for a moment she simply held it in her mind, turning it over, trying to locate the trap inside it. There didn't appear to be one. "The beans are locally sourced," she said. "The owner changed suppliers last year. Most people don't notice." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, held back. He looked at her the way someone looks when a small, surprising thing is just confirmed, a thought they hadn't yet finished forming. "Most people don't," he agreed quietly. Then his phone rang, and he glanced at the screen, and the moment, whatever it had been, folded itself shut. He moved toward the door, and she watched him go without meaning to. She told herself it meant nothing. That was the reasonable, grounded thing to tell herself, and she did it while refilling the sugar caddies and while wiping down the end of the counter and while carrying a tray of ceramic mugs back from the dishwasher station. He had come back. He had made a small remark about locally sourced coffee beans. His phone had rung, and he had left. That was the entire inventory of what had happened, and none of it added up to anything she was permitted to feel. The morning rush thinned to the usual mid-morning quiet. 2 women with laptops, an older man reading a folded newspaper like it was still 1987, a college student who ordered a single black tea and had been nursing it for 40 minutes. She moved through the room the way she always did, efficiently, without performing cheerfulness, without disappearing either. She had learned early in this job that customers didn't need warmth so much as they needed to feel unconsidered. Not invisible, just unbothered. There was a dignity in that, even if no one had ever thought to name it. Her manager came out of the back at 10:30 and watched her work for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Corporate called this morning," he said finally, keeping his voice low. She paused with a damp cloth in her hand. "About yesterday?" "About a lot of things." He glanced toward the front windows. Apparently, someone made a note about how the incident was handled. Her chest tightened. "I was going to offer to pay for the—" "Not that kind of note," he interrupted, and something in his tone made her hold still. "A positive one, filed directly with the regional office, about professionalism, composure under pressure." He looked faintly baffled. "About the staff." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, which was usually the right answer. He shrugged as if the whole thing puzzled him too and went back to the stockroom. She stood at the end of the counter for a moment, the cloth still in her hand, and let herself consider what that meant without pretending she didn't already suspect who had filed it. She wasn't naive. She had worked service jobs since she was 17, and she understood very well that powerful men sometimes did generous things for reasons that weren't generous at all. Protection could be performance. kindness could be leverage. She had learned to be grateful for neither until she understood what they were actually costing her. But the note had not come with any strings attached that she could see. No message, no request, no appearance on her shift this afternoon to collect whatever gratitude he had decided she owed him. Just a word, filed quietly, through official channels, where it would do her actual practical good. She thought about that for longer than she meant to. By her afternoon break, she had stopped telling herself it meant nothing. That felt dishonest in a way she wasn't willing to be, at least not with herself. She sat in the small break room behind the kitchen, drank water from a paper cup, and admitted, privately, that she had been thinking about him since the moment he walked out the door. She wasn't the kind of person who indulged in daydreams. She had trained herself out of that years ago, somewhere between the second eviction and the third job she had taken to cover rent. Her mother couldn't make a loan. Daydreams were expensive. They cost attention you needed for real things, and they left you soft in places where you couldn't afford to be soft. So she was careful, sitting in that break room with her paper cup, to identify what she was actually feeling before she allowed herself to feel it any further. It wasn't infatuation. She was almost certain of that. She barely knew what he looked like, beyond the broad impression of stillness and dark fabric, and a hand raised calmly to stop a man twice her confidence level from dismantling her afternoon. What she kept returning to wasn't his face. It was the gesture, the economy of it. The fact that he had not made a scene of his own mercy, had not looked around to see who was watching him be decent. He had simply been decent, and then left. In her experience, people with that kind of power did not often do things quietly when loudly was available. She rinsed her cup, returned it to the small stack by the sink, and went back out to the floor. The afternoon passed the way cafe afternoons did, in waves of noise and small requests and the particular low-grade exhaustion that came from being pleasant to strangers for hours. She refilled. She apologized for delays that were not her fault. She smiled at a table of women celebrating something, genuinely happy for them in the distant way she had learned to be happy for other people's good occasions. It was not unkind, that distance. It was just the shape her heart had learned to hold things in. She was wiping down the counter near the window when the manager appeared at her elbow, a little too close, a little too quiet. He told her that someone had called the cafe's main office that morning. Not the complaint line, the main office, and that whoever it was had spoken directly to someone she had never heard of, a name she didn't recognize, an administrative level she hadn't known existed above the regional manager. He said it in the careful tone of someone who had received information he didn't fully understand and was not sure whether to be impressed or unsettled by it. She kept her expression neutral and asked what the call had been about. He said it was about her, a commendation of sorts, not official, but the kind of unofficial that carried weight, the kind that left a note in a file and made certain people remember a name when decisions were being made. She thanked him. He nodded, still wearing that uncertain expression, and moved away. She turned back to the counter and pressed the cloth flat against the surface in one slow, even stroke. And she thought about a man who owned something enormous and had chosen to use it for something small. Used it precisely because it was small, because she was small, in the way that the world measured these things, and he had noticed anyway. The bell above the door rang. She looked up. It was him. She knew it before she fully processed what she was seeing, before her eyes had traveled from the door to his face. She knew it the way you know a storm before it arrives, by the change in pressure, by something wordless and certain moving through you. He stepped inside with the same contained stillness he carried like a second skin, wearing a dark coat over a charcoal suit. No bodyguard this time, and the bell above the door fell silent again, as though even it had decided to behave. The cafe was mid-afternoon quiet. 2 students in the corner, a woman reading near the window, the soft hiss of the espresso machine. He looked around the room once, briefly, and then his eyes found hers across the counter, and he stopped. She didn't move. She wasn't sure she was breathing. He crossed the room without hurry and took the same stool at the counter he had sat on before, the one nearest the window, the one where the light came in at an angle that made the steam from the cups look like something out of a painting. He set his hands flat on the surface and said nothing. He simply looked at her, and the look was neither demanding nor dismissive. It was careful. It was the look of someone who had thought about what he wanted to say and had not yet decided whether to say it. She asked if he wanted coffee. He almost smiled. She saw it begin and then steady itself, as though he had learned long ago not to let things arrive too quickly. He said yes, please, and the please landed differently than politeness usually does. It landed like something he meant. She turned to the machine, and her hands were steady, which surprised her. She had been unsteady for days. She had been unsteady since the morning he walked in the first time, and her tray tilted and the world rearranged itself without asking her permission. But her hands were steady now, and she focused on that, on the small mechanical certainty of grinding and pressure and heat, because it was something she could hold. She set the cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it without drinking and said he had heard the situation at work had been resolved. He said it neutrally, as though he were reporting something observed from a distance. But she heard the thread beneath it, the thin line connecting the words to the call her manager had received, to the note in a file, to the weight of a name used quietly and precisely. She said it had. She thanked him. The words felt insufficient. She had practiced, in the quiet moments between orders, what she might say to him if he returned. But now the practiced words had all dissolved, and what remained was only the truth, plain and exposed. He nodded slowly and finally lifted the cup. He drank. He set it down. And then, without quite looking at her, he said that he came back because he wanted to know something. Not about the job, not about the incident. Something else. She waited. He turned the cup once in his hands, a small, deliberate motion, and raised his eyes to hers. He asked her name. She told him. It was only 2 syllables, a name she had carried her whole life without ceremony. A name her mother had chosen from a book of saints because she believed in the idea that a name could be a kind of protection. She had never thought much about it until she said it to him, watching his face, and something shifted there, not dramatically, not in any way she could point to and define, but a settling, as though a question had been answered that he had not known he was carrying. He repeated it quietly, not echoing it, not testing it, something closer to acknowledging it. The way you say the name of a place when you finally arrive somewhere you had only read about. She asked him why he wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. The cafe was never fully quiet. There were always cups against saucers, conversation at the other tables. the low, persistent hum of the espresso machine, the occasional scrape of a chair. But in that moment, the sounds seemed to recede, politely, as though giving them space. He said that he had sat across from a great many people in his life: business associates, attorneys, people who wanted something from him, which was most people. People who measured their words around him. He said he had grown so accustomed to that particular kind of attention, the careful, calculating kind, that he had almost stopped noticing it. It had become the temperature of every room he entered. Then he said that when she had stood in front of him after the spill, trembling and young and completely unguarded, she had not been calculating anything. She had only been afraid, and then sorry, and then something else. Something he had not been able to name until the second time he came back. She asked what that something was. He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. He said it was the absence of performance. He said she had not been performing courage, or performing humility, or performing anything at all. She had simply been herself, in a way that had become almost foreign to him, in a world where everyone around him had rehearsed their version of who they were before walking into his presence. She felt the words settle into her chest. She did not know exactly what to do with them. She was not accustomed to being described as notable, let alone as rare. She said that she was just a waitress. He said he knew that. He said it plainly, with no softening and no condescension, only acknowledgement, as though her work was simply a fact about the world and not a measurement of her worth. She refilled his coffee without being asked, because her hands needed something to do, because the conversation had become something larger than she had expected, and she needed one ordinary, familiar motion to keep herself grounded. When she set the carafe down, he asked if she ever took a break. She looked at him carefully. He said he was only asking whether there was time, whether she might sit just for a moment, and that he would understand completely if the answer was no. She told him she had 7 minutes before the lunch rush began in earnest. She did not know why she said it with such precision. Perhaps because precision felt like a kind of armor, something measurable, something that would end on its own and relieve her of having to decide when to walk away. He nodded and waited while she untied her apron and folded it over the counter's edge. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with the careful posture of someone who was not entirely sure she was permitted to be there, even though she was the one who had worked this floor for 3 years and knew every loose tile and temperamental espresso machine in the building. The chair felt different from the customer side. She noticed that immediately. The light came from a slightly different angle. The noise of the cafe arranged itself differently around her. He did not try to fill the silence right away. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. When he did speak, he asked about the morning, not about her, not about him, not about the shirt or the coffee or the strange orbit they had been moving in since she had stumbled into his world with both hands full. He asked how she thought the morning had gone, as though she were a colleague debriefing at the end of a shift rather than a waitress sitting across from a man whose daily decisions moved more money than she would earn in a lifetime. She told him honestly. She said the morning had been difficult, that they were understaffed, and that the espresso machine on the far counter had been temperamental since Tuesday, and that she had been carrying too many things at once, which was how the accident had happened in the first place. She said it without apology this time. She stated it as context, not confession. He listened in the way she was beginning to recognize, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. Then he said something quiet. He said that the people who actually kept things running were almost never the ones anyone thought to ask about how things were going. He said it without making it into a speech. He said it the way someone says a thing they have been sitting with privately for a long time and are only just now choosing to release into the open air between two people. She looked at him. Not the practiced, polite look she gave customers when she was managing them. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you suddenly understand that a conversation has been about something real all along, and you were not the only one who felt it. Her 7 minutes were almost gone. She could feel it without checking the clock. The sound of the cafe was shifting. More chairs, more voices, the particular quality of noise that preceded the lunch hour like a tide change. She did not stand up immediately. She waited one more breath's worth of time. So did he. And in that small, unhurried pause, something unnamed passed between them, honest and unguarded and entirely without rehearsal. She stood, not quickly, not reluctantly, the way you stand when you have received something worth carrying and you do not want to spill it by moving carelessly. She picked up her order pad from the edge of the table, tucked it against her side, and offered him the same small nod she might have given any customer at the end of a visit. Except it was not the same. They both knew it was not the same, and neither of them said so, and that made it more true. The lunch rush arrived the way it always did, all at once, loud and demanding and completely indifferent to anything that had just happened in the corner booth. She moved back into the current of it, refilled, delivered, apologized for a wait that was not her fault, kept her face composed and her hands steady, which required no particular effort because something inside her had settled, quietly and without announcement, into a place that felt less like waiting and more like standing. He stayed another 20 minutes. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, not intrusively, just present. When she finally passed his table to clear a neighboring one he had left, the cup was empty. The jacket was folded neatly over the back of the chair. Beneath the saucer, he had left the exact change for the coffee, plus a tip that was not extravagant enough to be a statement, but generous enough to be intentional. Next to it was a business card, placed face down. She did not turn it over immediately. She finished clearing the table beside it, then wiped his table, then picked up both the saucer and the card together and carried them back toward the counter. She turned the card over in the kitchen doorway. She read it once, then again. The logo was small and precise in the upper left corner, the same logo that appeared on the cafe's cups, on the menu's back page, on the little brass plaque beside the entrance that she had passed every single shift for 2 years without ever once reading carefully. She stood there for a moment with the card in her hand. Then she did something that surprised her. She did not feel embarrassed about the spilled coffee. She did not feel small about the apron or the order pad or the 7-minute break taken in a corner booth. She felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that none of that had mattered to him in the way she had feared, and that it had mattered to him enormously in the way she had not expected. He had seen exactly where she was. He had chosen to sit in that reality with her rather than above it. She tucked the card into her apron pocket. The afternoon continued. Tables turned. Coffee was poured without incident. But something in the room had changed its shape, the way light changes when a window is opened that has been closed for a long time. Not dramatic, not sudden, only undeniably different, and full of the particular warmth that only comes from something real beginning.